What's up guys, Doug Polk here and welcome back to Poker Hands. Today we've got a pretty sweet hand from Live at the Bike between Dan Smith and Darren Elias, where both of them decided to play a little bit of poker. I guess you always are playing poker when you play poker, but you know what I mean, This hand happened at 100, 200 with a $400 big blind, so it's going to be a cash game hand. But before we jump into the action, I want to let you know that if you're looking to improve your cash game skills, I'd recommend checking out the Upswing Poker Lab. If you're a small or mid-stakes player, the Upswing Lab's the perfect place to start improving your game so you can move up in stakes and play with the big boys. Unlike a lot of training sites where there's just a big video library and you don't know what to do, we start at the beginning and we walk you through everything. So if you're looking to improve your game, check out Upswing Poker. I'll put a link in the description below. With that out of the way, let's go ahead and jump into the action.
So it looked like what happened was that Darren just bet 7K. Yaniv had maybe a few thousand more than that, but he had less than we had him at 13. Maybe he had about 10 there. And he shoved all in for the rest of it. And obviously Darren called. Yaniv just wanted to get it in there as he was leaving, I guess, and didn't want to fold middle pair, facing the huge bet from Darren. It's just a strange hand, strange way to end as Darren's big bet gets Yaniv to stack off.
Head over now.
Our hand begins at some just modest $100, $200 stakes, but Dan Smith under the gun decides to straddle, making it $400 to go. The action folds around to Darren Elias in the small blind. Now, typically this is a tough spot because you're out of position against two players who can play pretty loose and aggressive against you. But when you got pocket jacks, you're definitely going to be looking to play. I think in this situation, you probably want to play your top something around 20% of hands or so, play tight, and fold most of your hands to the guys behind you. But now with pocket jacks definitely good enough to play. So you're going to want to raise it up probably something around 4 times the big blind, which Darren does decide to do, and now the action's over to the big blind. The big blind decides to fold. Now Dan Smith looks down at King 10 in the straddle. Certainly a hand you're going to want to play. You have to call $1,200, sure, but you're getting around 2-to-1 odds here in the straddle, and so with position, you're definitely going to realize that equity. This hand's too good to fold, but also probably not strong enough to 3-bet. There are a lot of other hands I might want to pick over this guy, so this is actually a spot where you can't raise, fold, or call. Interesting. Feels like the show's going downhill. Anyway, Dan does decide to call, and let's take a flop.
I'll have a young lady call you. Or text you or something, okay? I appreciate the help. Thank you. $1,400.
The flop comes ace-3 deuce with 2 diamonds, a board neither player is too excited about. Darren is not happy that the aces come, as a bunch of Dan's hands could have an ace in their pre-flop, although the best ones would probably 3-bet. The rest of them would be calling. In Dan's shoes, he gets just enough to maybe want to see a turn to river with the backdoor nut flush draw having the king of diamonds, and so he's got a little bit of playability. Darren decides to kick things off with a small bet in the flop. I don't mind this at all. An interesting thing to think about here is the size of your pocket pair matters a lot when deciding if you want to bet. For example, if you have pocket kings here, I probably wouldn't be betting too often. But if you have a hand like pocket 4s, 5s, or 6s, you get a lot more value by betting because your opponent could definitely have overcards to your hand. In fact, they're almost certainly going to have overcards to your hand. And so by betting, you either get value or deny them equity with those holdings. When you've got the stronger pairs, well, they either hit the ace or they didn't, and so it's a little bit less of a situation you want to be betting with. However, I'd still throw it in, and with jacks, I don't mind betting here at all. Now over to Dan with his backdoor nut flush draw. He's got some options here. I think folding would be a little bit too conservative. I don't like that, so he really can call or raise. One of the cool things about raising this hand occasionally is that it gives you a hand that can bluff if the turn is a diamond. If the turn is a diamond, he can barrel knowing that now he has the nut flush draw, and if it bricks off, he might want to just fire the river as well because he can take the pot down with a good blocker. but you mainly want to be raising the flop here when you have either strong hands or flush draws or gutters. So I think that the main play here should be for him to call, which he does decide to do, and let's take a turn.
You know?
Wait, like he shoved on him and then he gets sacked like
No, no, I'm not making fun of that.
No.
Shoved on him because they had an agreement not to.
Check.
raise.
Should have been raised.
Yeah. 10 seconds. 32. 3200.
The turn comes in offsuit 7. Neither player improves. And now in Darren's shoes, you gotta check. If you put more money in here, you're making this pot too big for your hand. And by checking, you give yourself some room to maybe check call and see what's going on. Darren does decide to check, and now Dan's got a bit of a situation. He has to decide what he wants to do with his king high. No, his hand isn't very good, and if his opponent does have a hand like pocket jacks or a turn 7, or maybe a lower pair, he's ahead of him, and if he checks it back and tries to show this down, he's going to lose. The problem is he could also have some bluffs. He can have some flush draws or straight draws that didn't raise the flop, that are weaker than king high, and so it's a little bit of a tricky situation to know what to do. I think overall in this spot, I like a little bit of both betting and checking. Mix it up, do a bit of both. If you do check it back on the turn, maybe look to bluff some rivers if you got a good run out. Anyway, Dan does decide to fire here on the turn, and he can have plenty of good hands. He could have an ace, he could have a slow played hand from the flop, like a set or a straight, and he could have maybe even a hand like pocket 7. So there are certainly some value bets that Dan's repping, but he's mainly saying, hey man, I've got an ace, I called pre-flop because I had an ace, I called the flop because I got an ace, and now I'm going to bet for value. So his story is very credible here, and he can certainly choose a decent amount of bluffs. Dan does decide to bet, and now the action's over to Darren. And this is a situation where you're going to want to start to think about blockers. Now, I know some of you guys don't like talking about blockers, those nerdy kids these days with their calculators, but it does matter. Let's think about this, for example. Darren does not have the jack of diamonds here. Well, if he did have the jack of diamonds, now Dan can't have a hand like a jack high flush draw, right? Because that card is gone. So because he doesn't have a diamond in his hand, it's now more likely that Dan has a flush draw. Also in this situation, one of Dan's most common value bets will be ace jack. The reason is that he'll always call ace jack pre-flop, or almost always. He might throw in a 3-bet every now and then, but it's not going to be strong enough to re-raise against a small blind raise into 2 blinds. If he has ace king, he's probably going to 3-bet. If he has ace queen, he's probably going to 3-bet, but ace jack is mainly going to flat. So he does block a bunch of the value bets and does not block some of the bluffs. Because of these reasons, I think Darren's going to have to go ahead and check call here, which he does, and let's take a river.
Check. Seconds. All in. All in. Well, there it goes.
And an all-in from Dan Smith with king high. Wow. Darren checks about 13K in the pot, and he's going to polarize it with king high on this board, and Darren has jacks. And I just can't imagine Darren Elias calls here. 2 tournament goats here, Darren Elias and Dan Smith putting Darren Elias in a tough spot.
The river comes one of the biggest bricks in the deck, an offsuit 3. Now, neither of these players are going to be playing many hands with a 3 preflop, and Dan's not going to be betting a 3 on the turn very often, so this is a card that really bricks for both players and doesn't change the board texture much at all. Darren checks it over to Dan, and now Dan has to decide what to do. Well, he's going to have to bluff here sometimes. If he has a hand like ace-jack or ace-10, he's going to have a very strong hand. If Darren had that hand beat on the turn, he'd bet himself. So if I was in Dan's shoes with ace-jack, even though going all in here is a little bit of an overbet, I'd do that and feel pretty good about it. It's hard to imagine many hands that have you beat, and your opponent could certainly call you with a lot of worse aces. So Dan could have a couple of traps from the flop, maybe a hand like pocket sevens, maybe a hand like ace 7, and then also some very strong aces like if he did flat ace queen, ace jack, and also ace 10. It's certainly possible for Dan to bet with a smaller ace here, but I think those hands would not want to use such a big size because going all in will force a lot of your opponent's hands to fold. Anyway, what should Dan do here? Should he bluff with his king 10? Well, let's think about some factors. First off, having a diamond to bluff in this spot, especially the king of diamonds, I don't like it that much because now it's not possible for Darren to have check called the turn with a nut flush draw. Let's just imagine for a second that Darren could have a hand like king queen of diamonds. Well, he might bet the flop and then check call the turn. That hand would always fold the river, but it's not possible now because we have the king of diamonds. So I probably lean more towards bluffing with a hand like, let's say we had like king 4 of spades, you know, a gutter and the backdoor flush draw. That might be a hand that makes a little more sense to me to bluff with. You don't block some of the floats that bricked their draw, and so your removal is going to be a little bit stronger. But if you only ever bluffed with hands like that, then it would be a little bit predictable to play against you. Sometimes you gotta bluff with the hands that aren't quite as good to bluff. You just shouldn't do it very often. Well, for Dan, sometimes you just gotta know when to pull the trigger. Back over to Darren. We're in a tough spot, guys. We have pocket jacks. Our opponent is saying that they've got a good hand. What do we want to do here? Well, jacks, for a lot of the same reasons that we decided to call the turn, makes a somewhat reasonable river call. And this is the thing, when you face a big bet in No Limit Hold'em, which is one of the best things about the game, that you can bet whatever size you want, rather than thinking about like just strictly how good is my hand, sometimes you gotta think about what blocks my opponent's value bets, what doesn't block my opponent's bluffs. You want them to have missed flush draws here. You want them to have missed straight draws here. You don't want them to have hands like ace jack, ace 10, or 2 pair. And on a river that pairs the board like this, well, now it's even less likely that Dan does have a hand like 2 pair that made a full house. Yes, you're going to lose either way if he's got ace jack or ace 10 or a full house, but those things are less likely, and ace jack is one of his more common value bets. So in Darren's shoes, what hands make the most sense to call? Well, jack seems better than kings, right? Because Dan can't have ace king. So jacks and 10s without a diamond is starting to look a lot better as calls compared to some of those old other hands. That doesn't make this an easy call, and doesn't make this necessarily the right call versus all players. But sometimes on Live at the Bike, when you got pocket jacks and there's an ace out there, you just gotta say fuck it and calm down.
No way.
Oh my God!
He calls.
Oh my God!
Oh
That was
my
the most
God.
insane hand I've ever commentated on.
Wow.
That's just a sick one.
Darren bet flop and check called turn on an ace high board with jacks. And now Dan's going to continue the story on the river. Dan flatted pre from the straddle. His story here is essentially saying he has a hand like 4-5, ace 3.
I don't know. It's just leave it there. Yeah. Yeah.
Like Dan's not gonna bet with a random 3 too often on the turn, so it's got to be a hand like ace 3. Pocket 7s, no, but Dan wouldn't probably call the flop with pocket 7s, so pocket 2s, pocket 3s, ace 3, or 4-5. Those are the likely hands for value that Dan Smith is saying he has here. And Darren Elias, great player, thinking it through. A lot of people would have folded by now with jacks on an ace-high board when their opponent goes all in for more than pot in the river. But Darren Elias is a great player. He has a weird feeling about this, that he could be good, and he's going to try to figure it out and see if it's worth making a sick hero call. We haven't seen Dan Smith do anything like this tonight yet. Darren Elias and Dan Smith.
Count 16, 16.
Darren trying to figure out what bluffs Dan could have here. Well, Darren doesn't have a diamond in his hand, so Dan could have missed diamonds. Hand like 6-4 of diamonds. Really any diamonds. Would he do this with just an ace? Probably not. So Darren can rule out the random ace X hands, as it's unlikely that Dan's going to shove this much with just an ace in this spot. Darren raised pre-flop from the small blind. We are playing with a round of straddles, 4 blinds, 5,100, 200, 400. And Darren raised to 1,600, and Dan defended. Darren bet the flop on ace high board. He check called the turn. And Dan shoved for more than pot. 16,000 on the river into about 13,000. This would be quite the call if Darren Elias makes this call. A lot of the players at this table would have folded quickly. Oh, he makes the call. Wow. What a call by Darren Elias, the GOAT.
Well, normally the saying is for ace king, but in this situation, it looks like king 10 has got Dan walking back to Houston. Thanks for joining me today for Poker Hands. If you like this video, hit the thumbs up button and subscribe, and I'll see you again next week.